It helps if I switch the mic on. That's good. Good evening and welcome to the Free University of Brighton. This is a philosophy course and we're looking at Plato and Deleuze. So if you're here, that's for a Free University of Brighton philosophy course on Plato and Deleuze. Now, the way this course is going to be working is that the lectures will take place on Twitch. For the Free University of Brighton people, there will then be a seminar on Zoom. If you're not in the Free University of Brighton, you're welcome to obviously watch the lectures and you're welcome to ask questions on Discord. I have a Discord there that you can join if you're particularly interested. There are links to the Discord on my Twitch page. But this is a Free University of Brighton course, Plato and Deleuze. And as I say, if you're in the Free University of Brighton, then there'll be a Zoom seminar rather, at 8 p.m. And the links to the Zoom seminar are in River. And if you're a member of FUB, you know what River is. So let's just do a little bit of like what we call it, housekeeping. That's the word. A little bit of housekeeping. So this is a kind of reading course. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you want to get something out of it, then the best thing you can do is read along. I'm not going to be giving you all of the content in the lectures, as it were. I'm going to be talking about texts, and I'm going to be talking about particular texts, specific ones, and so it's going to be useful if you want to follow the course if you read those texts. Obviously you're welcome to listen along as well if you just want to. I don't have any objection to that, but you'll get most out of this course if you read the texts as we're going along. And the course is going to be split into two parts. Let's just get that up for you. So the course is going to be split into two parts. And the first part, we're going to be reading Plato. And then we'll be reading some critique of Plato from Deleuze. And I use the phrase critique rather than criticism. That's ambiguous in some ways. Critique usually means kind of pushing things to the limits, seeing what kind of internal problems exist in something, whereas criticism usually means producing a counter argument. And so that's the way the course is going to operate. And the Plato we'll be reading, we obviously can't read all of Plato, there's an awful lot there. So we're going to start with the Phaedrus, and then we'll look at the Sophist, and then we'll probably look at extracts from a text called the Statesman. The Phaedrus deals with questions of love and rhetoric. The Sophist deals with questions of knowledge and wisdom, and the Statesman deals with questions of politics. And the idea of this course, which is the first time I've run this course, so this is kind of a new course for me as well as for anyone coming along, but the idea of this course is for us to engage in a philosophical debate, to look at a philosophical debate around Platonism, and take a particular kind of critique of Plato, a particular way of understanding Plato that is developed by Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher from the 1960s and 70s. In fact, all the way, I think he died in 94, so all the way up to 94. And we're going to look at Deleuze's criticisms and critique of Plato, and the idea here is that someone like Deleuze is often seen as needing a lot of background. They're the kind of philosopher that you might be told something like, you can't understand Deleuze until you've read philosophy, read an awful lot of philosophy, and often that's a kind of strange injunction, because it kind of puts people off. It kind of makes you feel like, oh, it's just too complicated and it's just too difficult. There's no possibility of us doing that, so I'm just going to ignore them. And so what I'm trying to do here is take some of that background that would be seen as necessary to understand some of what Deleuze is saying and put the two things together. So we're going to put the background of Plato together with the criticisms and critique that Deleuze develops of Plato, and we're going to try and see if we can sort of understand both Plato and Deleuze through this course. Not all of Deleuze and not all of Plato, of course, but try and understand both of them in, as it were, in dialogue. Now, with this kind of material, the classical philosophical material, in some sense Plato is obviously classical philosophical, Western philosophical material, and Deleuze is obviously contemporary, what's called continental philosophy, with this kind of material, it's often possible to go into an enormous amount of depth. I think I'm peaking a little bit on my microphone. Sorry if that's a bit squizzy. It's often possible to go into an enormous amount of depth. And to write a lot about sort of very small sections of text. So you might take a few pages from Plato or a few pages from Deleuze and write a whole book about this. And so it's definitely possible to do this. And that deep dive does mean that we have the capacity to explore questions in quite a lot of depth. But it's also possible, I think, as a philosopher, for us to learn how to think and learn how to do philosophy, learn to swim in a situation in which we're reading quite important and difficult philosophers. And as I put up on the screen there, I don't think you have to be in shallow waters in order to learn to swim. Of course, can be a little bit safer. And usually it would be recommended to start in shallow waters. And so this course isn't really shallow waters, but it is still possible, if you don't have any background in philosophy, to engage in this. And I will try and keep things, as it were, accessible. I will try and bear in mind that a lot of people are still learning to swim. So if you feel like you're learning to swim in philosophy, this is still a course that may be of interest to you. You don't have to be some kind of expert. You don't have to have already been studying philosophy for years. Now, it's important in this course, because of the way we are living at the moment under COVID, it's important for us to try and just bear in mind the way in which we're trying to learn together here. Now, as you obviously, if you're looking at this video or you're watching this video live, then the lectures are being given in this kind of public format, and there is a chat room and stuff that can go along with that. But unlike in a classroom setting, it's a lot harder for me to engage directly in dialogue. And so I think what I would like to sort of suggest is it is possible for people involved, particularly when they're watching live, it is possible for you to ask questions, but try and ask questions of each other as much as of me, because I'm probably not going to be able to directly engage during the course of the lecture very heavily with questions, which is unfortunate, and it's one of the kind of limits in some ways of the way in which these kind of modes of interaction operate. What else might be useful just before we really get going? So if you're watching this after the case, if you're watching a recording, then there will be playlists up on Twitch and on YouTube, and there's also a Facebook page you can get to, so that whichever is your preferred medium, you're welcome to follow along there. But as I said, the most important thing to remember is that this is a course that kind of is probably best if you're interested in reading some of these texts. And as I say, the first text we're going to be looking at is Plato's Phaedrus. If you don't have access to that, then there are various versions online, and if you're in River and the Free University of Brighton, then obviously I've been putting bits and pieces up there. There's some videos up there, some background videos, and there's copies of the text linked there. I'm using Penguin Classics. I think you can probably see this, hopefully. Let's just check that you can see that. Let's go back here. So yeah, I'm using this particular text, which is just a Penguin Classic at the moment. I actually have more than one version, unsurprisingly. I've been a philosopher for quite a long time and have quite a few different texts. So if a Penguin Classic book you can pick up quite cheaply, be great to do that. It's much more useful in some ways to have something you can kind of write on or note on, either the text itself, a cheap second-hand one perhaps, or a notebook, and use that alongside the course. So what we're going to do first, and this is going to be quite quick and quite skimmy in some ways, but what we're going to do first is a little bit of basic Plato, because you might not be familiar at all with who Plato is and what Plato's ideas are kind of about. So the first thing to say is that Plato writes a series of dialogues. What do I mean by dialogues? I mean they look a little bit like plays. So if you read them, you're kind of reading through a play. If you've never read through a play, then just think of it as a script for a film, kind of reading through something that's not simply in your head. It has a kind of setting. There is a frame of a frame for the dialogue, so the dialogues take place somewhere, and there are a set of characters in those dialogues, and so it's often useful to get a sense of that. And the crucial thing to remember is that Plato writes the words of Socrates. So this is where we get the Socratic dialogue notion. This is something that we use inside philosophy, the idea of Socratic dialogue. Quite often Socratic dialogue is given to people in the form of a question and answer session. And that's quite often what we find inside Plato's dialogues, where Socrates is the person that's let's say not the person who knows, that's not quite accurate, but the person who is like the main interlocutor, the main person involved in the dialogue. He's the main character. And there's a series of other characters around him that he's talking to, and each dialogue takes place in a certain location. And so it's worth bearing this in mind. It's very important, and it's something I'm going to be coming back to as we go through the course. But Plato basically is the first of what we think of as Western philosophy, the first person, the first kind of key moment in what we think of as Western philosophy. Now, it's interesting and important to note that Western philosophy is only one particular tradition of philosophy, and for those of you on River and who may have seen the links that I put to Bettany Hughes's documentary on Socrates, Bettany Hughes puts Socrates in the context of the Buddha and of Confucius, and so she locates Socrates within a kind of general movement that's taking place some 2,500 years ago, in which there's a completely sort of new, in some ways, a new kind of approach to thinking, and both the Buddha and Confucius as well as Socrates offer a kind of new mode of thinking in many ways, and Socrates is just one element of this. So it's worth bearing this in mind, that Socrates and Plato are kind of the origins in some sense of Western philosophy, but Western philosophy isn't all of philosophy. There's other elements to this, and I would encourage anyone who's not got any sense of who Socrates or Plato are to go and look at Bettany Hughes's documentaries about them on the BBC. They're good, interesting. They're an hour long each, and they're a really nice little introduction to the kind of Socratic moment, the birth of a kind of new mode of thinking, perhaps, of which Socrates and Plato are key figures. But within Western philosophy, we quite often think of Plato as the origin moment. And it's even been suggested that the rest of Western philosophy, this is a famous idea, it consists of footnotes to Plato. And so Plato is, in a sense, produced the basic stuff, the basic set of problems and basic set of arguments that the rest of us then have to deal with, and work our way through and understand and have some sort of relationship to. And in a sense, that's kind of what I want to do by bringing Plato and Deleuze together. I want to bring kind of this origin moment and this much more contemporary moment. I mean, Deleuze is a particularly strange philosopher in many ways. Michel Foucault said that the particular century we live in now would be a century of Deleuze, and Deleuze is a very, very widespread, widely read and widely used contemporary philosopher. And so we're trying to put this kind of origin moment and this contemporary response to it together in this. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But some basic Plato, or some basic Socrates, but some basic Plato, we can identify, and this obviously is a brief intro, so it is basic, but we can identify some very straightforward and fairly commonly understood elements to what Plato has to say. So let's identify the first three of these points here, which are commonly understood to be key elements of Plato. First, we have a thing called the theory of forms, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a moment. Second, we have a thing called the divided line. Third, we have the allegory of the cave. Now, you may or you may not have heard of these particular aspects. They're all quite closely interrelated, and in a sense, they're all kind of ways of trying to present the same worldview, the same understanding of what it is to know and what it is to know the world around us. But there's a fourth element that isn't really the content of what Plato is saying in some sense. So those first three moments, the theory of forms, the divided line, and the allegory of the cave, these are content that Plato puts forward inside his dialogues. But there's also the frame, the methodology, if you like, that is being used. And the methodology, crucially, is this relationship of the dialogue. And in the dialogue, we can often see what Deleuze would call, and other people might call, free and direct discourse. So the dialogues consist of characters speaking, and when these characters are speaking, it's very easy for us to mix up what the characters are saying and what Plato is saying. It's not easy to necessarily distinguish exactly what Plato is saying from what the characters are saying. So it's important in some sense to realise that the dialogues, they're not a game, but they are a kind of play. They're a way of playing out arguments and playing out philosophical positions. And what's crucial here is not really to worry too much about, for us at this point, to not worry too much about whether a particular argument or a particular position is one that can be, said to be Plato's position. What's important for us is to try and deal with the dialogues themselves and deal with the way in which the arguments are sort of interacting with each other. Now, I'm saying that because it's very common for us to assume that the author of a text is saying what they mean. And so when they present an argument, or when they say something in that text, it's very easy for us to ascribe it to the author, and this needs to be, we need to be careful about doing that. It's not really important, in a sense, for us in this situation as to whether this is a particular position of Plato or a particular position of Socrates. What's important for us is to focus on the way in which the arguments work and the arguments play through. Having said that, let's just, and I don't want to say that Plato hasn't got anything to say. The most common way of understanding what Plato has to say is with this theory of forms. This is the single most common way of ascribing a content to Plato. In other words, it's the single most common way in which you might say, find someone saying Plato had a theory of, it would be in this case a theory of forms. Now, a theory of forms is, in contemporary philosophy, essentially a theory of what we might now call universals. And for anyone who did the existentialism course with me a little while back, that was something that we were looking at there, in the way in which existentialism has a particular take on the relationship between universals and particulars. Now, in the Platonic theory of forms, or the theory of forms that's ascribed to Plato, the way in which the form operates is that the things that are, let's say, beautiful, so there might be many, many different things that are beautiful, but each of them is beautiful in some way because it participates, or it has some connection with this form of the beautiful. And so the easiest way of us thinking about the form, perhaps, is that the form is what's shared amongst different objects and actions. And so what makes a bed, even if it may have a radically different look or shape from another bed down the road or another bed in another century, what makes a bed is that they all kind of share in the form of the bed. And the same could be said about chairs or cars or a whole series of things. And so what we have here is a way of connecting or grouping things together, which is the common way of understanding universals, connecting or grouping things together. So connecting and grouping particulars, objects in the world, actions in the world, and showing what is common amongst them. And that thing that's common amongst them is, for Plato, the way in which they participate in the form. So they kind of are connected into it. Now, what's important here is to remember that the theory of forms, whilst it almost certainly is a key element of Plato's work, is also something strongly criticised within Plato's work, in particular in a dialogue called the Parmenides, where there's a very strong criticism of the theory of forms. Now, the Parmenides is a very complex dialogue and not one that I'm going to be looking at all in this course. In fact, it would probably take a whole course to look coherently at the Parmenides, or the Parmenides. And so, whilst it wouldn't be unreasonable, and it's not unreasonable, to say that Plato has a theory of forms, he also has very strong criticisms of such a theory, and it's not unreasonable for some people to sort of think that in fact the theory of forms is almost like a tool for us to begin to be able to think critically. It's a way of us dealing with a particular problem. So let's have a brief look at this theory of forms. Now, the most important thing, this is a diagram I found that I thought was quite nice. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite work out where it had come from. It was listed up there. But this is a diagram that I thought was quite nice. And so what we've got here is, first of all, what's important to be sort of absolutely essential is to note that this particular dividing line. Now, I've already said that one of the other things is the divided line, but we'll come back to that in a second. But this kind of, there's a strong split, there's a strong division here between these things at the bottom, which are particulars, and these things at the top, which are forms. There's also very clearly a kind of hierarchy, a movement up into this thing that's called the form of the good. And so when we have, let's say, a coffee table or a dining table, these are participating in the form of the table, but the form of the table can be itself also participating in the form of the good. In other words, there can be good tables. There is a good form of the table, and obviously a bad form of the table. And in the good form of the table, which is, as it were, the table really, that good form of the table participates, insofar as it's a good form, in the form of the good. And so this division and hierarchy are kind of crucial to understanding what's going on, and we'll come back to why in a moment. Now, forms themselves are these are the real things. This is the almost counterintuitive element to Plato, and there is something very, very counterintuitive to what's going on in the theory of forms. So the real things in the world are the forms, whereas the things we encounter in the world, which we would normally think of as real, these are in a process of change. These are spatio-temporal, they are changeable, they're what we might think of as sensible. In other words, what I mean by that is they are encountered through sensation. They're never quite perfect. They're not, things in the world have always got a little bit of errors and little bits that don't quite work in them. But that stuff in the real world inside the Platonic model is transitory. And because it's transitory and because it's not perfect, it's not itself real. It participates in reality, but the reality itself comes from the forms. And getting to know the forms is essentially part of the process that dialogue is engaged in, part of the process that the Socratic dialogue is engaged in. It's trying to engage us in a dynamic in which we don't take things in front of us, the world as it is, to be the truth of things. And it's trying to engage in a process in which we kind of move past the illusion of the world, in some sense, towards the truth of the world. And so that's absolutely crucial to understand, that there's this hierarchy and that there's this counterintuitive relationship to what's most real inside the world. Now, the divided line, as I mentioned earlier, is there. You can see it inside that Platonic theory of forms, where you've got the particulars at the bottom and you've got the forms at the top. So there's obviously a kind of divided line there. Over the line, things are real and have being. Below the line, things are transitory and are in becoming. But the divided line also operates, as I say, in terms of how we are being brought to understand the truth. And so the divided line is a schema, in other words, a kind of model or diagram of the development of knowledge. Now, this one goes from left to right, and so we kind of begin in this situation. Let's go back over here. We begin over here with in the visible realm, inside the cave. We'll come to the cave in a moment. We begin in the visible realm, and this is the realm of opinion, and we're going to be able to move, if we follow Plato, from this visible realm where we just have an opinion about something into the invisible realm, the realm of the forms, where we actually begin to know the truth about something. And so the idea of Plato is to take us from this position through all the stuff that we know in the world that's visible, past just pure visibility, into the invisible realm and the realm of knowing the truth of things. And so we're engaged in this movement from here over in this direction. And Plato kind of gives us a series of stages, as it were, that we're going to move through. So we're going to move through imagination and sort of fantasy and like images of things in the world. Then we're going to move into believing things about the world, and having convictions and believing that this is the way the world is. And we're going to sort of develop from just having impressions and images into having beliefs and convictions. And quite often we're going to be using language to move from one to the other, which is why it's often called a rhetorical belief or conviction, because it's come about through the use of language. Now, this particular movement, just from images of how things might look and to understanding something about them and beginning to develop a belief about them, this particular dynamic still is inside the visible realm. So having beliefs is not enough in order for us to have a truth, in order for us to know things as they really are. In order to do that, we have to begin to go beyond the senses, go beyond the way in which we encounter things just in everyday life and in the world, and we have to go into the realm in which we can know things through the mind, and in which our intellect begins to become, as it were, our primary sense. And obviously, the five senses that we have outside are the way we encounter things in the visible realm, and the intellect is a kind of another sense that is being deployed and used here. And we're beginning to rely upon that more and more as we move through this scheme from left to right, or from up to down, depending upon how you want to think about it. Because there is a hierarchy here. This side of the line is higher in value than this side. But as we begin to know things with our mind, we begin to have what's called mathematical reason. We begin to understand, as it were, the logic of some things. But as we begin to pursue that logic and pursue that kind of mathematical reason, geometrical reason, for example, as we begin to pursue that, we begin to encounter positions and points at which problems occur, sometimes contradictions, where we can have two arguments that present opposite sides of the things but both seem very logically strong, and we begin to then bring conflicting logical results into dialogue, into a dialectic, and at that point we enter into the highest form of knowledge, dialectical reason, where we're actually we're not just using our mind, we're using our mind in a sophisticated and articulated way. Now that dynamic is absolutely crucial all the way through Plato's work. There is clearly, when you read Plato, something that we might call a kind of therapeutic or a pedagogic way of doing things. So Plato is constantly trying to teach. He's constantly trying to bring people from a position that they're in to some other position that they can only get to through the dialogues and through the use of the intellect. And he's trying to bring people out of opinion and into knowledge. An opinion is sometimes called doxa. This is the Greek for opinion, and knowledge is often called episteme, and that's the root for the philosophical concept of philosophical methodology of epistemology, which is the logic of knowledge, or the science of knowledge. Now, the other thing that Plato is quite famous for is the cave, the allegory of the cave. Now, in the allegory of the cave, what we have is a kind of story about the way things are in the world. So if you remember, we begin in the divided line from seeing things. But in the allegory of the cave, what's said is that the things we are seeing, the things that we see in front of us, are kind of illusions. They're not the way things really are. And they are shadows cast on a wall. So we're kind of seeing the world almost through a screen. We're seeing something that's almost kind of projected. And what occurs is, inside this allegory, is that Plato describes us as being trapped. In fact, he calls us prisoners. Prisoners inside the cave. Now, the reason we're inside a cave is because the light is not shining on things. The true light of reality is not shining on things. And all we have is firelight. And firelight projects onto a wall shadows. And so we have a situation in which we have us, the prisoners, looking at the wall, and there's a fire projecting light onto the wall here, and here are things taking place in the world that are seen not in themselves, but only as they are projected onto the screen, projected onto the wall from the firelight. And in the allegory of the cave, a prisoner breaks free and escapes the cave, goes out into the sunlight, and is, startled and shocked by the sunlight, and sees things as they really are in their true light, and eventually then comes back into the cave and tells the prisoners that they are not seeing the world as it really is, not seeing it in its true light, and doesn't get a very good reception for this. And this is a kind of allegory not only of the way in which we are perceiving the world, as prisoners in a cave, but also an allegory of what happens if you try and tell people this. And so it's an allegory that, in a sense, if you try and tell people the truth about the world, as Socrates supposedly did, people won't actually appreciate that. And in Socrates' case, they didn't appreciate that. And he ended up being convicted of the corruption of the youth and various other things, and committed suicide by drinking hemlock because the Athenians had kind of convicted him of being a pain in the arse, basically. Now, one of the things that's kind of crucial in both this course and in dealing with Plato himself and the works of Plato is that we're not simply learning arguments. We're not simply learning what someone says about the world. What we're trying to do is we're trying to learn through problems. And so the dialogues are the presentation of a series of problems and the working through of those problems. And so you can't, as it were, take something said at the beginning of a dialogue or halfway through a dialogue and be just lifted out of context. It's taking place at a particular moment within a narrative dynamic, within a whole framework in which there's people engaged in trying to work through a problem. And so when we're engaging with a Platonic dialogue, what we're trying to do is work out what's the problem, what's going on. And more importantly, for the whole of Plato, there's a kind of process of learning through Plato's, and learning through problems, and we can ask ourselves, what's the big problem here? What's prompting Plato to sort of do the work that he's doing? What's prompting Socrates to do the work that he's doing? And the big problem, we might say, is how can we know what is true if the world is divided between appearance and reality? If we don't, or if we can't trust the appearances to be the reality, how are we going to know quite what is real? How can we know the truth if we have this appearance-reality distinction? And this is important to think about, because this appearance-reality distinction is absolutely crucial, absolutely central to Plato and to Socrates. It's crucial, obviously, in a sense, to that notion of the theory of forms. It's crucial to the way in which the divided line works, and it's what's presented critically inside the allegory of the cave. Now, that idea about appearance and reality is a long-standing one, and one that appears in contemporary life regularly. So it's the same problem in a sense that we encounter in a film like The Matrix. The distinction between what's real and what's the appearance. The Matrix is an appearance of reality rather than reality itself. And if you take the right pill, you can kind of access the real itself. Now, the reason we want to think about this kind of framework and this framing of the problem and this framing of the idea of like how can we know the truth if there is an appearance-reality distinction is because what we don't want to do is just simply focus on whether a particular argument is right or wrong. That is important, but it's not the only thing we want to do. What we also want to do, particularly when we're trying to read Plato, is look at how the problem has been set up. What that context is. So if you remember, I was saying that Platonic dialogues have a location and a set of characters, and they have a kind of narrative dynamic. That framework is not just pretty, ornamentation. Quite often it's very important as to what kind of problem exists. It gives us a clue, it gives us indications, it kind of subtly, I wouldn't say subconsciously, but it kind of subtly points us to what the big problem really is. And one of the things that I'm going to very briefly introduce just here, I'm just going to put this slide up for now. I'm not even going to talk about it because we're going to have a break in a moment. But one of the problems and one of the frameworks that I want to sort of think about and work through a little bit as we go through the course is that one of the big issues prompting the Socratic and Platonic moment is the rise of the city and the problems that it has. And I think what I would like to think about and what I would like people to think about is that when the city arrives, when the city begins to be a kind of key functional center of civilization, we get a new set of questions. There are a whole new sort of set of questions produced, and I've put some points here just to indicate why there are problems of deceit that begins to be increasingly prevalent, problems of power, problems of centralization, problems of abstraction, and problems of individual and the collective in relationship to something that we might call democracy. And so that idea of us, as it were, thinking about the framing or the setting up of the problems, that not only in terms of the Platonic dialogue, but also we want to be able to take a step back and think about what is it that's prompting Plato to ask these questions, prompting Socrates to engage in these dialogues. What's prompting this relationship to an appearance reality distinction and the problem of truth within that? Okay, so it's 38 minutes past 7 at this particular point in time. What I'm going to do is take a 5-minute break and then talk a little bit about the Phaedrus, and then we'll have a seminar. And we'll be coming back to the Phaedrus next week. So if you're wanting to do some reading, that's the thing you need to start reading for next week. Begin reading the Phaedrus. If you've already read chunks of it, begin looking at it again after our conversations today. So it's going to take a break now. So 5 minutes, stretch your legs, have a walkabout, grab a cup of tea, those kind of things, and I will see you in 5 minutes. Okay, so welcome back. We're just going to last 10 minutes or so of this session, and I just want to talk a little bit here about the Phaedrus. So the Phaedrus, first of all, is not the same as the Phaedo. There are two different texts, two different dialogues that have similar kind of names with Plato, so do keep an eye out for that. It's the Phaedrus. And what's going on here? So let's talk a little bit about that setting and framing. So Socrates is talking to Phaedrus. That's what happens throughout the whole dialogue. But Socrates is talking to Phaedrus at first about a speech given by someone called Lysias. And Phaedrus and Lysias, let's say, what's suggested that seems to be going on in the background is that Phaedrus is a relatively young man. Lysias, like Socrates, is a bit older, and within the Greek cultural relationship, there's a kind of sexual tension, a sexual dynamic going on here. One that's kind of not contemporary in our current understanding of sexual dynamics. One that's kind of mixed in like a mentorship. And one of the things that seems to be going on in the background to this text is Socrates saying something like, just be a little bit careful, Phaedrus, Lysias is after you and he's not entirely honest about his intentions here. And so there's this kind of strange background of interpersonal relationships, and in particular interpersonal relationships when it comes to sex and love, lust perhaps we ought to say, and love, that is in the background here, and the way in which manipulation and deceit are operable in these kind of situations. So the text is kind of set up into there's at least 5 different moments that we can identify or we can see inside the text. For those of you who are on River, I put a video up there that also went through a kind of outline of the text, so I'm not going to copy that or just replicate that. But there's at least 5 different moments that we can think of in the text. At first, there's Socrates and Phaedrus meeting and being kind of engaging in this discussion in which Socrates is trying to get Phaedrus to present Lysias's recent speech, and that's the first kind of moment, that discussion between Socrates and Phaedrus, that kind of persuasive moment, and the presentation of Lysias's speech. The second moment is where Socrates kind of mimics Lysias's speech, but trying to present a counter argument in some ways. And then there's the next moment is when Socrates basically goes, well, actually we've kind of been just playing a game so far, and actually it's not a very good game, it's a bit blasphemous, and begins to actually articulate something that we might identify as more like what it is presented as him thinking. And this is what's sometimes called Socrates' second speech, which we can identify because he begins to talk about divine madness and love and divine madness. Then there's a discussion about the relationship to love and language and lust and deceit, which kind of ends with this very curious moment in the text, but it's a good way of identifying a kind of moment of break, a curious moment in the text where they kind of break off and start talking about cicadas and the myth of cicadas. It's a bit of a strange kind of moment, but that's a kind of another moment. And then after that, the final part of the text, the part of the text that in some sense is possibly most famous because we begin to talk a lot more, we begin to see talk about the nature of rhetoric and truth, and the idea of speech and writing, and how it is possible to present the truth, how it is possible to present arguments. Now, one of the reasons I want to sort of emphasize this beginning point is that, in a sense, all the way up to the point at which Socrates starts his second speech, which, if you're using the Stephanos pagination, is around 244. So all the way from 230 to 244, what we have is a kind of game. We can almost see it as a kind of flirting. There's almost a kind of we could, if we were watching it from the outside, which of course we kind of are, we can almost sense the tension going on here. Or at least that's how I read this. Other people might want to read it slightly differently, but I read it, that whole first thing, as a kind of game. And the other reason I'd suggest that is because when we encounter the first speech that's presented to us, Lysias's speech, it's very clear that the person is being deceitful. It's a clever speech, but one that immediately makes us feel like there's something else going on, and there's a kind of someone trying to be persuaded against their will by someone with a bunch of clever words about to do something that they don't really want to do. And Lysias's speech essentially makes a claim. It's a claim that the admirer who is not in love is to be preferred to the one who is. And when we say admirer here, what we mean is, and this is fairly clear in the text, is someone who wants to have sex with you. Someone who, so we have Lysias, and we have this kind of setup of a speech in which Lysias has written a speech where he's trying to persuade someone who he's in lust with, who he wants to have sex with, that actually he doesn't love them, and that is a good reason. This is a reason for them to engage in relationships, because he doesn't love them, and that this is actually much better for them, and there are a whole series of ways in which he tries to present that, and it's basically going, I'm gonna, I want to, Lysias's speech is something like, I want to have sex with you, but I don't love you, and actually that's much better for you. You're going to be much better off in that situation because I don't love you. And so the question, in a sense, I mean, it's a kind of, and Socrates is going to dismiss it as well. The question, in a sense, is, something like, is the lover to be preferred to the non-lover when engaging in relations of a sexual kind, not just in a broad sense. Now, that setup, that whole way in which the idea of deceit at the heart of Lysias's speech is being kind of presented, is kind of crucial, because the use of language in its appearance, the use of language to present something that appears to be true, appears to be right, is what Socrates is going to be trying to attack later on in the text, and is what's kind of crucial to the Phaedrus. In a sense, what the argument will be is that, clever speech doesn't mean truth is being revealed. And in fact, we need to be very careful that the person giving us clever speech is actually interested in the truth, and not just appearing to be clever and persuading you of something that you don't really want to be persuaded of, but you're not quite sure why they're wrong. And so from the beginning, there's this whole kind of way in which this is not just a question of abstract intellect. People are involved, relations are involved, manipulation and deceit is involved. The deployment of the intellect and rhetoric as a kind of power to manipulate is involved. All of these things are not just simply, idle questions. These are questions that if you're at the heart of this, if you are the person that's targeted by Lysias's speech and Lysias's rhetoric, you're a person that's liable to get hurt, and you're the person, that's not going to, come out of this feeling good about yourself or good about what's happened to you. You're going to feel like you've been manipulated. And that relationship, obviously, is one we encounter very, very commonly in relationship, not just to people around us, but in particular in things like politics and stuff where we have this kind of difficulty in working out whether what someone is saying is sincere, whether what they're saying is true. But alongside deceit, there's also irony, and one of the places in Socrates' first speech, for example, at the start of this, we see this irony being deployed. Socrates says something like, let me make Lysias, he's talking to Phaedrus and he's about to start his speech, and this is at 237 in the text. And Socrates says something like, let me make Lysias seem more brilliant to you, Phaedrus, who you already think highly of him, but let me make him seem even more brilliant to you. And when Socrates says that in the text, this is ironic. This is not what he wants to do. He wants to make Lysias seem wrong. He wants to make Lysias seem like he's doing something that's not right, not good, not the appropriate way of doing something. And so what we encounter is deceit and irony very early in the text. And this means that things aren't what they appear. This is a kind of crucial element in both deceit and irony. Things aren't as they appear to be, which is, both something that occurs inside life, but also a way of presenting this difficulty of dealing with the distinction of appearance from reality, and how we encounter truth when we think there's a distinction between appearance and reality that's kind of real or actually there. Now, there is one other element, and this element is kind of, I'm just going to finish on this tonight, and it kind of touches again on the element at the end of the sort of slides that I put up about the city. There's one other element that we need to think about here, and this is the staging of the dialogue. It's crucial to understand that the dialogue is staged outside of Athens, and in most situations the dialogues are within Athens. It's crucial to understand that the relationship to nature, to what we might think of as the countryside, is central to the dialogue, and so a third character is Lysias on the one hand, and another character is the location of the countryside that they're working with. And Socrates says something very interesting at 2:30. He says that the people in the city have something to teach me, but the fields and the trees don't teach me anything. And this is not necessarily going to be actually true later on. We're going to see some elements in which that may not be the case, and we'll talk about those next week maybe. But what I want to sort of note here is that the way in which this distinction is made between people can teach him something, but the fields and the trees can't, and the reason for this is fundamentally because people talk. And he can learn. And he says at one point, when he's persuading Phaedrus to try and tell him what Lysias' speech is, to give him a presentation of Lysias' speech, Socrates says something like, he's almost addicted to speeches. He's almost addicted to hearing the way in which people want to present their particular arguments or positions. And so the themes of the Phaedrus are speech, appearance, and reality, and truth, and how we get at truth within that particular complex, within that particular sort of set and problem set. And so that's what we need to think about as we read through the Phaedrus, but also, as I say, you want to think about that kind of setting and framework and the way in which the story takes place, and try and imagine the dialogues taking place. Okay, I'm going to end there. If you're following this on a recording, I'm not going to be recording seminars, but you are welcome, obviously, if you're in FUB, to join the seminars on Zoom, which will start in a couple of minutes. And if you're not in FUB, then you're welcome to ask questions and join a Discord, which is linked on the Twitch channel, where you can ask stuff there. Give the channel a follow if you can. Feel free to invite anyone else to watch. This is doing philosophy in public, and if you're not aware of what the Free University of Brighton is, they look it up. We're on the internet, and we're always interested in people getting involved. With that, I will see you next week, unless you're a member of FUB and you've got the Zoom link to the seminar, in which case I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you very much.